There is a Reaper by Charles V. DeVette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Monette. There is a Reaper by Charles V. DeVette. The amber brown of the liquor disguised the poison it held, and I watched with a smile on my lips as he drank it. There was no pity in my heart for him. He was a jackal in the jungle of life, and I was one of the carnivores. It is the lot of the jackals of life to be devoured by the carnivore. Suddenly the contented look on his face froze into a startled stillness. I knew he was feeling the first savage twinge of the agony that was to come. He turned his head and looked at me, and I saw suddenly that he knew what I had done. "You murderer!" he cursed me, and then his body arched in the middle and his voice choked off deep in his throat. For a short minute he sat tense, his body stiffened by the agony that rode it, unable to move a muscle. I watched the torment in his eyes build up to a crescendo of pain until the suffering became so great that it filmed his eyes, and I knew that, though he still stared directly at me, he no longer saw me. Then, as suddenly as the spasm had come, the starch went out of his body, and his back slid slowly down the chair edge. He landed heavily with his head resting limply against the seat of the chair. His right leg doubled up in a kind of jerk before he was still. I knew the time had come. "Where are you?" I asked. This moment had cost me $60,000. 3 weeks ago, the best doctors in the state had given me a month to live, and with $7 million in the bank, I couldn't buy a minute more. I accepted the doctor's decision philosophically, like the gambler that I am, but I had a plan, one which necessity had never forced me to use until now. Several years before, I had read an article about the medicine men of a certain tribe of aborigines living in the jungles at the source of the Amazon River. They had discovered a process in which the juice of a certain bush, known only to them, could be used to poison a man. Anyone subjected to this poison died, but for a few minutes after the life left his body, the medicine men could still converse with him. The subject, though ostensibly and actually dead, answered the medicine men's every question. This was their primitive, though reportedly effective, method of catching glimpses of what lay in the world of death. I had conceived my idea at the time I read the article, but I had never had the need to use it until the doctors gave me a month to live. Then I spent my $60,000, and 3 weeks later I held in my hands a small bottle of the witch doctor's fluid. The next step was to secure my victim, my collaborator I preferred to call him. The man I chose was a nobody, a homeless, friendless nonentity, picked up off the street. He had once been an educated man, but now he was only a bum, and when he died he'd never be missed. A perfect man for my experiment. I'm a rich man because I have a system. The system is simple. I never make a move until I know exactly where that move will lead me. My field of operations is the stock market. I spend money unstintingly to secure the information I need before I take each step. I hire the best investigators, bribe employees and persons in position to give me the information I want, and only when I am as certain as humanly possible that I cannot be wrong do I move. And the system never fails. $7 million in the bank is proof of that. Now, knowing that I could not live, I intended to make the system work for me one last time before I died. I'm a firm believer in the adage that any situation can be whipped, given prior knowledge of its coming, and, of course, its attendant circumstances. For a moment he did not answer, and I began to fear that my experiment had failed. "Where are you?" I repeated, louder and sharper this time. The small muscles about his eyes puckered with an unnormal tension, while the rest of his face held its death frost. Slowly, unnaturally, as though energized by some hyper-rational power, his lips and tongue moved. The words he spoke were clear. "I am in a tunnel," he said. "It is lighted dimly, but there is nothing for me to see." Blue veins showed through the flesh of his cheeks like watermarks on translucent paper. He paused, and I urged, "Go on." "I am alone," he said. "The realities I knew no longer exist, and I am damp and cold. All about me is a sense of gloom and dejection. It is an apprehension, an emanation, so deep and real as to be almost a tangible thing. The walls to either side of me seem to be formed not of substance, but rather of the soundless cries of melancholy of spirits I cannot see. I am waiting in the gloom for something which will come to me. That need to wait is an innate part of my being, and I have no thought of questioning it." His voice died again. "What are you waiting for?" I asked. "I do not know," he said, his voice dreary with the despair of centuries of hopelessness. "I only know that I must wait, that compulsion is greater than my strength to combat." The tone of his voice changed slightly. "The tunnel about me is widening, and now the walls have receded into invisibility. The tunnel has become a plain, but the plain is as desolate, as forlorn and dreary as was the tunnel. And still I stand and wait. How long must this go on?" He fell silent again, and I was about to prompt him with another question. I could not afford to let the time run out in long silences, but abruptly the muscles about his eyes tightened, and suddenly a new aspect replaced their hopeless dejection. Now they expressed a black, bottomless terror. For a moment I marveled that so small a portion of a facial anatomy could express such horror. "There is something coming toward me," he said. "A beast of brutish foulness. Beast is too inadequate a term to describe it, but I know no words to tell its form. It is an intangible and evasive thing, but very real, and it is coming closer. It has no organs of sight as I know them, but I feel that it can see me, or rather that it is aware of me with a sense sharper than vision itself. It is very near now. Oh God, the malevolence, the hate, the potentiality of awful, fearsome destructiveness that is its very essence, and still I cannot move." The expression of terrified anticipation centered in his eyes lessened slightly and was replaced instantly by its former deep despair. "I am no longer afraid," he said. "Why?" I interjected. "Why?" I was impatient to learn all that I could before the end came. "Because," he paused, "because it holds no threat for me. Somehow, someday, I understand, I know, that it too is seeking that for which I wait." "What is it doing now?" I asked. "It has stopped beside me, and we stand together, gazing across the stark, empty plain. Now a second awful entity, with the same leashed virulence about it, moves up and stands at my other side. We all three wait, myself with a dark fear of this dismal universe, my unnatural companions with patient, malicious menace. Bits of, he faltered, I can name it only aura, go out from the beast like an acid stream and touch me, and the hate and the venom chill my body like a wave of intense cold. Now there are others of the awful breed behind me. We stand waiting, waiting for that which will come. What it is, I do not know. I could see the pallor of death creeping steadily into the last corners of his lips, and I knew that the end was not far away. Suddenly, a black frustration built up within me. "What are you waiting for?" I screamed, the tenseness and the importance of this moment forcing me to lose the iron self-control upon which I have always prided myself. I knew that the answer held the secret of what I must know. If I could learn that, my experiment would not be in vain, and I could make whatever preparations were necessary for my own death. I had to know that answer. Think, I pleaded. What are you waiting for? I do not know. The dreary despair in his eyes, sightless as they met mine, chilled me with a coldness that I felt in the marrow of my being. I do not know, he repeated. Yes, I do know. Abruptly, the plasmatic film cleared from his eyes, and I knew that for the first time since the poison struck, he was seeing me clearly. I sensed that this was the last moment before he left, for good. It had to be now. "Tell me, I command you," I cried. "What are you waiting for?" His voice was quiet as he murmured softly, implacably, before he was gone. "We are waiting," he said, "for you." End of There Is a Reaper by Charles V. DeVette.
Time Fuze by Randall Garrett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Silk. Time Fuze by Randall Garrett. Commander Benedict kept his eyes on the rear plate as he activated the intercom. "All right, cut the power. We ought to be safe enough here." As he released the intercom, Dr. Leiker, of the astronomical staff, stepped up to his side. "Perfectly safe," he nodded. "Although, even at this distance, a star going nova ought to be quite a display." Benedict didn't shift his gaze from the plate. "Do you have your instruments set up?" "Not quite, but we have plenty of time. The light won't reach us for several hours yet. Remember, we were out racing it at 10 lights. The commander finally turned, slowly letting his breath out in a soft sigh. "Dr. Leiker, I would say that this is just about the foulest coincidence that could happen to the first interstellar vessel ever to leave the solar system." Leiker shrugged. "In one way of thinking, yes. It is certainly true that we will never know now whether Alpha Centauri A ever had any planets. But in another way, it is extremely fortunate that we should be so near a stellar explosion because of the wealth of scientific information we can obtain. As you say, it is a coincidence, and probably one that happens only once in a billion years. The chances of any particular star going nova are small. That we should be so close when it happens is of a vanishingly small order of probability." Commander Benedict took off his cap and looked at the damp stain on the sweatband. "Nevertheless, Doctor, it is damned unnerving to come out of ultradrive a couple of 100 million miles from the first star ever visited by man and have to turn tail and run because the damned thing practically blows up in your face." Leiker could see that Benedict was upset. He rarely used the same profanity twice in one sentence. They had been downright lucky at that. If Leiker hadn't seen the star begin to swell and brighten, if he hadn't known what it meant, or if Commander Benedict hadn't been quick enough in shifting the ship back to ultradrive. Liker had a vision of an incandescent cloud of gaseous metal that had once been a spaceship. The intercom buzzed. The commander answered, "Yes?" "Sir, would you tell Dr. Liker that we have everything set up now?" Liker nodded and turned to leave. "I guess we have nothing to do now but wait." When the light from the Nova did come, Commander Benedict was back at the plate again. The forward one this time, since the ship had been turned around in order to align the astronomy lab in the nose with the star. Alpha Centauri A began to brighten and spread. It made Benedict think of a light bulb connected through a rheostat, with someone turning that rheostat, turning it until the circuit was well overloaded. The light began to hurt Benedict's eyes, even at that distance, and he had to cut down the receptivity in order to watch. After a while, he turned away from the plate, not because the show was over, but simply because it had slowed to a point beyond which no change seemed to take place to the human eye. 5 weeks later, much to Liker's chagrin, Commander Benedict announced that they had to leave the vicinity. The ship had only been provisioned to go to Alpha Centauri, scout the system without landing on any of the planets, and return. At 10 lights, top speed for the ultradrive, it would take better than 3 months to get back. "I know you'd like to watch it go through the complete cycle," Benedict said, "but we can't go back home as a bunch of starved skeletons." Liker resigned himself to the necessity of leaving much of his work unfinished, and, although he knew it was a case of sour grapes, consoled himself with the thought that he could at least get most of the remaining information from the 500-inch telescope on Luna 4 years from then. As the ship slipped into the not-quite space through which the ultradrive propelled it, Liker began to consolidate the material he had already gathered. Commander Benedict wrote in the log, 54 days out from Sol. Alpha Centauri has long since faded back into its pre-blow-up state. Since we have far outdistanced the light from its explosion, it now looks as it did 2 years ago. Pardon me, Commander," Liker interrupted, "but I have something interesting to show you." Benedict took his finger off the keys and turned around in his chair. "What is it, Doctor?" Liker frowned at the papers in his hands. "I've been doing some work on the probability of that explosion happening just as it did, and I've come up with some rather frightening figures. As I said before, the probability was small. A little calculation has given us some information which makes it even smaller. For instance, with a possible error of plus or minus 2 seconds, Alpha Centauri A began to explode the instant we came out of ultradrive. Now, the probability of that occurring comes out so small that it should happen only once in 10 to the 467th seconds." It was Commander Benedict's turn to frown. "So?" "Commander, the entire universe is only about 10 to the 17th seconds old. But to give you an idea, let's say that the chances of its happening are once in millions of trillions of years." Benedict blinked. The number, he realized, was totally beyond his comprehension. Or anyone else's. "Well, so what? Now it has happened that one time. That simply means it will almost certainly never happen again." "True. But, Commander, when you buck odds like that and win, the thing to do is look for some factor that is cheating in your favor. If you took a pair of dice and started throwing sevens, one right after another, for the next couple of 1,000 years, you'd begin to suspect they were loaded." Benedict said nothing. He just waited expectantly. "There is only one thing that could have done it. Our ship." Liker said it quietly, without emphasis. "What we know about the hyperspace, or superspace, or whatever it is we move through in ultradrive is almost nothing. Coming out of it so near to a star might set up some sort of shock wave in normal space, which would completely disrupt that star's internal balance, resulting in the liberation of unimaginably vast amounts of energy, causing that star to go nova. We can only assume that we ourselves were the fuse that set off that nova." Benedict stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice was a choking whisper. "Do you mean the sun, Sol, might..." Liker nodded. "I don't say that it definitely would, but the probability is that we were the cause of the destruction of Alpha Centauri A, and therefore might cause the destruction of Sol in the same way." Benedict's voice was steady again. "That means we can't go back again, doesn't it? Even if we're not positive, we can't take the chance." "Not necessarily. We can get fairly close before we cut out the drive, and come in the rest of the way at sublight speed. It'll take longer, and we'll have to go on half or one-third rations, but we can do it. How far away? I don't know what the minimum distance is, but I do know how we can gauge a distance. Remember, neither Alpha Centauri B or C were detonated. We'll have to cut our drive at least as far away from Sol as they are from A. I see. The commander was silent for a moment. Then, very well, Dr. Leiker. If that's the safest way, that's the only way. Benedict issued the orders, while Leiker figured the exact point at which they must cut out the drive, and how long the trip would take. The rations would have to be cut down accordingly. Commander Benedict's mind whirled around the monstrousness of the whole thing, like some dizzy bee around a flower. What if there had been planets around Centauri A? What if they had been inhabited? Had he, all unwittingly, killed entire races of living, intelligent beings? But how could he have known? The drive had never been tested before. It couldn't be tested inside the solar system. It was too fast. He and his crew had been volunteers, knowing that they might die when the drive went on. Suddenly, Benedict gasped and slammed his fist down on the desk before him. Leiker looked up. "What's the matter, Commander?" "Suppose," came the answer, "just suppose that we have the same effect on a star when we go into ultradrive as we do when we come out of it." Leiker was silent for a moment, stunned by the possibility. There was nothing to say anyway. They could only wait. A little more than half a light year from Sol, when the ship reached the point where its occupants could see the light that had left their home sun more than 7 months before, they watched it become suddenly, horribly brighter. 100,000 times brighter. End of Time Fuse by Randall Garrett. Recording by Scott Silk of the Tales to Terrify Horror Story podcast.
Tony and the Beetles by Philip K. Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Bradford, Ngotngotaha, Pugh. Reddish-yellow sunlight filtered through the thick quartz windows into the sleep compartment. Tony Rossi yawned, stirred a little, then opened his black eyes and sat up quickly. With one motion, he tossed the covers back and slid to the warm metal floor. He clicked off his alarm clock and hurried to the closet. It looked like a nice day. The landscape outside was motionless, undisturbed by winds or dust shift. The boy's heart pounded excitedly. He pulled his trousers on, zipped up the reinforced mesh, struggled into his heavy canvas shirt, and then sat down on the edge of the cot to tug on his boots. He closed the seams around their tops and then did the same with his gloves. Next, he adjusted the pressure on his pump unit and strapped it between his shoulder blades. He grabbed his helmet from the dresser, and he was ready for the day. In the dining compartment, his mother and father had finished breakfast. Their voices drifted to him as he clattered down the ramp. A disturbed murmur. He paused to listen. What were they talking about? Had he done something wrong again? And then he caught it. Behind their voices was another voice, static and crackling pops. The all-system audio signal from Rigel 4. They had it turned up full blast. The dull thunder of the monitor's voice boomed loud. The war. Always the war. He sighed and stepped out into the dining compartment. "Morning," his father muttered. "Good morning, dear," his mother said absently. She sat with her head turned to one side, wrinkles of concentration webbing her forehead. Her thin lips were drawn together in a tight line of concern. His father had pushed his dirty dishes back and was smoking, elbows on the table, dark, hairy arms bare and muscular. He was scowling, intent on the jumbled roar from the speaker above the sink. "How is it going?" Tony asked. He slid into his chair and reached automatically for the Aerstat grapefruit. "Any news from Orion?" Neither of them answered. They didn't hear him. He began to eat his grapefruit. Outside, beyond the little metal plastic housing unit, sounds of activity grew. Shouts and muffled crashes as rural merchants and their trucks rumbled along the highway towards Carnet. The reddish daylight swelled. Beetlejuice was rising quietly and majestically. "Nice day," Tony said. "No flux wind? I think I'll go down to the N quarter a while. We're building a neat spaceport. A model, of course, but we've been able to get enough material to lay out strips for—" With a savage snarl, his father reached out and struck. The audio roar immediately died. "I knew it." He got up and moved angrily away from the table. "I told them it would happen. They shouldn't have moved so soon. Should have built up a Class A supply base first." "Isn't our main fleet moving in from Bellatrix?" Tony's mother fluttered anxiously. "According to last night's summary, the worst that could happen is Orion 9 and 10 will be dumped." Joseph Rossi laughed harshly. "The hell with last night's summary. They know as well as I do what's happening." "What's happening?" Tony echoed as he pushed aside his grapefruit and began to ladle out dry cereal. "Are we losing the battle?" "Yes," his father's lips twisted. "Earthmen losing to Beetles. I told them, but they couldn't wait. My God, there's 10 good years left in this system. Why'd they have to push on? Everybody knew Orion would be tough. The whole damn Beetle fleet's strung out around here, waiting for us, and we have to barge right in." "But nobody ever thought Beetles would fight," Leah Rossi protested mildly. "Everybody thought they'd just fire a few blasts and then—" "They have to fight. Orion's the last jump off. If they don't fight here, where the hell can they fight?" Rossi swore savagely. "Of course they're fighting. We have all their planets except the inner Orion string. Not that they're worth much, but it's the principle of the thing. If we'd built up strong supply bases, we could have broken up the Beetle fleet and really clobbered it." "Don't say Beetle," Tony murmured as he finished his cereal. "They're pas udeti, same as here. The word beetle comes from Beetlejuice, an Arabian word we invented ourselves." "What are you, a goddamn beetle lover?" "Joe," Leah snapped, "for heaven's sake." Rossi moved towards the door. "If I were 10 years younger, I'd be out there. I'd really show those shiny-shelled insects what the hell they're up against. Them and their junky, beat-up old hulks, converted freighters." His eyes blazed. "When I think of them shooting down Terran cruisers with our boys in them." "Orion's their system," Tony murmured. "Their system? When the hell did you get to be an authority on space law? Why, I oughta—" He broke off, choked with rage. "My own kid," he muttered. "One more crack out of you today, and I'll hang one on you you'll feel the rest of the week." Tony pushed his chair back. "I won't be around here today. I'm going to Carnet with my EEP." "Yeah, to play with Beetles." Tony said nothing. He was already sliding his helmet in place and snapping the clamps tight. As he pushed through the back door into the lock membrane, he unscrewed his oxygen tap and set the tank filter into action. An automatic response, conditioned by a lifetime spent on a colony planet in an alien system. A faint flux wind caught at him and swept yellow-red dust around his boots. Sunlight glittered from the metal roof of his family's housing unit, one of endless rows of squat boxes set in the sandy slope, protected by the line of ore refining installations against the horizon. He made an impatient signal, and from the storage shed his EEP came gliding out, catching the sunlight on its chrome trim. "We're going down into Carnet," Tony said, unconsciously slipping into the Pas dialect. "Hurry up." The EEP took up its position behind him, and he started briskly down the slope, over the shifting sand, towards the road. There were quite a few traders out today. It was a good day for the market. Only a fourth of the year was fit for travel. Beetlejuice was an erratic and undependable sun, not at all like Sol. According to the edutapes, fed to Tony 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. He had never seen Sol himself. He reached the noisy road. Pas udeti were everywhere, whole groups of them, their primitive combustion-driven trucks, battered and filthy, motors grinding protestingly. He waved at the trucks as they pushed past him. After a moment, one slowed down. It was piled with tis, bundled heaps of gray vegetables dried and prepared for the table, a staple of the Pas udeti diet. Behind the wheel lounged a dark-faced, elderly Pas, one arm over the open window, a rolled leaf between his lips. He was like all the other Pas udeti, lank and hard-shelled, encased in a brittle sheath in which he lived and died. "You want a ride?" the Pas murmured. Required protocol when an Earthman on foot was encountered. "Is there room for my EEP?" The Pas made a careless motion with his claw. "It can run behind." Sardonic amusement touched his ugly old face. If it gets to Carnet, we'll sell it for scrap. We can use a few condensers and relay tubing. We're short on electric maintenance stuff." "I know," Tony said solemnly as he climbed into the cabin of the truck. "It's all been sent to the big repair base at Orion for your war fleet." Amusement vanished from the leathery face. "Yes, the war fleet." He turned away and started up the truck again. In the back, Tony's EEP had scrambled up onto the load of tiss and was gripping precariously with its magnetic lines. Tony noticed the Pasudetti's sudden change of expression, and he was puzzled. He started to speak to him, but now he noticed unusual quietness among the other Pas in the other trucks behind and in front of his own. The war, of course. It had swept through this system a century ago. These people had been left behind. Now all eyes were on Orion, on the battle between the Terran Warfleet and the Pas-Udetti collection of armed freighters. "Is it true," Tony asked carefully, "that you're winning?" The elderly Pas grunted. "We hear rumors." Tony considered. "My father says Terran went ahead too fast. He says we should have consolidated. We didn't assemble adequate supply bases. He used to be an officer when he was younger. He was in the fleet for 2 years. The Pas was silent for a moment. "It's true," he said at last, "that when you're so far from home, supply is a great problem. We, on the other hand, don't have that. We have no distances to cover." "Do you know anybody fighting?" "I have distant relatives." The answer was vague. The Pas obviously didn't want to talk about it. "Have you ever seen your war fleet?" "Not as it exists now. When this system was defeated, most of our units were wiped out. Remnants limped to Orion and joined the Orion fleet." "Your relatives were with the remnants?" "That's right." "Then you were alive when this planet was taken?" "Why do you ask?" The old Pas quivered violently. "What business is it of yours?" Tony leaned out and watched the walls of the buildings of Carnet grow ahead of them. Carnet was an old city. It had stood thousands of years. The Pas-Udetti civilization was stable. It had reached a certain point of technocratic development and then leveled off. The Pas had intersystem ships that carried people and freight between planets in the days before the Terran Confederation. They had combustion-driven cars, audiophones, a powered network of a magnetic type. Their plumbing was satisfactory and their medicine was highly advanced. They had art forms, emotional and exciting. They had a vague religion. "Who do you think will win the battle?" Tony asked. "I don't know." With a sudden jerk, the old Pas brought the truck to a crashing halt. "This is as far as I go. Please get out and take your EEP with you." Tony faltered in surprise. "But aren't you going—" "No farther." Tony pushed the door open. He was vaguely uneasy. There was a hard, fixed expression on the leathery face, and the old man's voice had a sharp edge he had never heard before. "Thanks," he murmured. He hopped down into the red dust and signaled his EEP. It released its magnetic lines, and instantly the truck started up with a roar, passing on inside the city. Tony watched it go, still dazed. The hot dust lapped at his ankles. He automatically moved his feet and slapped at his trousers. A truck honked, and his EEP quickly moved him from the road, up to the level pedestrian ramp. Pas-Udetti in swarms moved by, endless lines of people hurrying into Carnet on their daily business. A massive public bus had stopped by the gate and was letting off passengers, male and female Pas, and children. They laughed and shouted, the sounds of their voices blended with the low hum of the city. "Going in?" A sharp Pas-Udetti voice sounded close behind him. "Keep moving! You're blocking the ramp!" It was a young female, with a heavy armload clutched in her claws. Tony felt embarrassed. Female Pas had a certain telepathic ability, part of their sexual makeup. It was effective on Earthmen at close range. "Here," she said. "Give me a hand." Tony nodded his head, and the EEP accepted the female's heavy armload. "I'm visiting the city," Tony said as they moved with the crowd towards the gates. "I got a ride most of the way, but the driver let me off here." "You're from the settlement?" "Yes." She eyed him critically. "You've always lived here, haven't you?" "I was born here. My family came here from Earth 4 years before I was born. My father was an officer in the fleet. He earned an emigration priority. So you have never seen your own planet. How old are you? 10 years. Terran. You shouldn't have asked the driver so many questions. They passed through the decontamination shield into the city. An information square loomed ahead. POS men and women were packed around it. Moving chutes and transport cars rumbled everywhere. Buildings and ramps and open-air machinery. The city was sealed in a protective, dust-proof envelope. Tony unfastened his helmet and clipped it to his belt. The air was stale-smelling, artificial, but usable. Let me tell you something, the young female said carefully as she strode along the foot-ramp beside Tony. I wonder if this is a good day for you to come in to Carnet. I know you've been coming here regularly to play with your friends, but perhaps today you ought to stay at home in your settlement. Why? Because today everybody is upset. I know, Tony said. My mother and father were upset. They were listening to the news from our base in the Rigel system. I don't mean your family. Other people are listening too. These people here, my race. They're upset all right, Tony admitted, but I come here all the time. There's nobody to play with at the settlement, and anyhow, we're working on a project. A model spaceport. That's right, Tony was envious. I sure wish I was a telepath. It must be fun. The female Pasudeti was silent. She was deep in thought. What would happen, she asked, if your family left here and returned to Earth? That couldn't happen. There's no room for us on Earth. Sea bombs destroyed most of Asia and North America back in the 20th century. Suppose you had to go back. Tony did not understand. But we can't. Habitable portions of Earth are overcrowded. Our main problem is finding places for Terrans to live in other systems, he added. And anyhow, I don't particularly want to go to Terra. I'm used to it here. All my friends are here. I'll take my packages, the female said. I go this other way, down this third-level ramp. Tony nodded to his EEP, and it lowered the bundles into the female's claws. She lingered a moment, trying to find the right words. Good luck, she said. With what? She smiled faintly, ironically. With your model spaceport. I hope you and your friends get to finish it. Oh, of course we'll finish it, Tony said, surprised. It's almost done. What does she mean? The Pasudeti woman hurried off before he could ask her. Tony was troubled and uncertain. More doubts filled him. After a moment he headed slowly into the lane that took him towards the residential section of the city, past the stores and factories, to the place where his friends lived. The group of Pasudeti children eyed him silently as he approached. They had been playing in the shade of an immense hengalo, whose ancient branches drooped and swayed with the air currents pumped through the city. Now they sat unmoving. I didn't expect you today, Beprith said in an expressionless voice. Tony halted awkwardly, and his EEP did the same. How are things? He murmured. Fine. I got a ride part way. Fine. Tony squatted down in the shade. None of the POS children stirred. They were small, not as large as Terran children. Their shells had not hardened, had not turned dark and opaque like horn. It gave them a soft, unformed appearance, but at the same time it lightened their load. They moved more easily than their elders. They could hop and skip around still. But they were not skipping right now. What's the matter? Tony demanded. What's the matter with everybody? No one answered. Where's the model? He asked. Have you fellows been working on it? After a moment, Lyrie nodded slightly. Tony felt dull anger rise up inside him. Say something! What's the matter? What are you all mad about? Mad? Beprith echoed. We're not mad. Tony scratched aimlessly in the dust. He knew what it was. The war again. The battle going on near Orion. His anger burst up wildly. Forget the war. Everything was fine yesterday before the battle. Sure, Lyrie said. It was fine. Tony caught the edge to his voice. It happened 100 years ago. It's not my fault. Sure, Beeprith said. This is my home, isn't it? Haven't I got as much right here as anybody else? I was born here. Sure, Lyrie said tonelessly. Tony appealed to them helplessly. Do you have to act this way? You didn't act this way yesterday. I was here yesterday. All of us were here yesterday. What's happened since yesterday? The battle, Beeprith said. What difference does that make? Why does that change everything? There's always war. There've been battles all the time, as long as I can remember. What's the difference about this? Beeprith broke apart a clump of dirt with his strong claws. After a moment, he tossed it away and got slowly to his feet. Well, he said, thoughtfully, according to our radio relay, it looks as if our fleet is going to win this time. Yes, Tony agreed, not understanding. My father says we didn't build up adequate supply bases. We'll probably have to fall back to... And then the impact hit him. You mean for the first time in 100 years? Yes, Lyrie said, also getting up. The others got up too. They moved away from Tony, towards the nearby house. We're winning. The Terran flank was turned half an hour ago. Your right wing has folded completely. Tony was stunned. And it matters? It matters to all of you? Matters? Beeprith halted, suddenly blazing out in fury. Sure it matters. For the first time in a century, the first time in our lives we're beating you. We have you on the run. You, he choked out the words, almost spat it out. You white grubs! They disappeared into the house. Tony sat gazing stupidly down at the ground, his hands still moving aimlessly. He had heard the words before, seen it scrolled on walls and in the dust near the settlement. White grubs, the past term of derision for Terrans, because of their softness, their whiteness, lack of hard shells, pulpy, doughy skin, but they never dared say it out loud before, to an Earthman's face. Beside him, his EEP stirred restlessly. Its intricate radio mechanism sensed the hostile atmosphere. Automatic relays were sliding into place. Circuits were opening and closing. It's all right, Tony murmured, getting up slowly. Maybe we'd better go back. He moved unsteadily towards the ramp, completely shaken. The EEP walked calmly ahead, its metal face blank and confident, feeling nothing, saying nothing. Tony's thoughts were a wild turmoil. He shook his head, but the crazy spinning kept up. He couldn't make his mind slow down, lock in place. Wait a minute, a voice said, Beeprith's voice, from the open doorway, cold and withdrawn, almost unfamiliar. What do you want? Beeprith came towards him, claws behind his back in the formal Pasudeti posture used between total strangers. You shouldn't have come here today. I know, Tony said. Beeprith got out a bit of tis stalk and began to roll it into a tube. He pretended to concentrate on it. Look, he said, you said you have a right here, but you don't. Tony murmured. Do you understand why not? You said it's not your fault. I guess not. But it's not my fault either. Maybe it's nobody's fault. I've known you a long time. 5 years, Terran. Beeprith twisted the stalk up and tossed it away. Yesterday, we played together. We worked on the spaceport, but we can't play today. My family said to tell you not to come here any more. He hesitated and did not look Tony in the face. I was going to tell you anyhow before they said anything. Oh, Tony said. Everything that's happened today, the battle, our fleet's stand, we didn't know. We didn't dare hope. You see? A century of running. First this system, then the Rigel system, all the planets, then the other Orion stars. We fought here and there scattered fights. Those that got away joined up. We supplied the base at Orion. You people didn't know. But there was no hope. At least nobody thought there was. He was silent a moment. Funny, he said. What happens when your back's to the wall and there isn't any further place to go? Then you have to fight. If our supply bases, Tony began thickly, but B. Prith cut him off savagely. Your supply bases. Don't you understand? We're beating you. Now you'll have to get out. All you white grubs. Out of our system. Tony's EEP moved forward ominously. B. Prith saw it. He bent down, snatched up a rock, and hurled it straight at the EEP. The rock clanged off the metal hull and bounced harmlessly away. B. Prith snatched up another rock. Lyrie and the others came out of the house. An adult posse loomed up behind them. Everything was happening too fast. More rocks crashed against the EEP. One struck Tony on the arm. Get out! B. Prith screamed. Don't come back! This is our planet! His claws snatched at Tony. We'll tear you to pieces if you... Tony smashed him in the chest. The soft shell gave like rubber, and the posse stumbled back. He wobbled and fell over, gasping and screeching. Beetle! Tony breathed hoarsely. Suddenly he was terrified. A crowd of Pasudeti was forming rapidly. They surged on all sides, hostile faces, dark and angry, a rising thunder of rage. More stones showered. Some struck the EEP. Others fell around Tony, near his boots. One whizzed past his face. Quickly, he slid his helmet in place. He was scared. He knew his EEP's E-signal had already gone out, but it would be minutes before a ship could come. Besides, there were other Earthmen in the city to be taken care of. There were Earthmen all over the planet, in all the cities, on all the 23 Beetlejuice planets, on the 14 Rigel planets, on the other Orion planets. We have to get out of here, he muttered to the EEP. Do something! A stone hit him on the helmet. The plastic cracked. Air leaked out, and then the autoseal filmed over. More stones were falling. The posse swarmed close. A yelling, seething mass of black-sheathed creatures. He could smell them, the acrid body odor of insects, hear their claws snap, feel their weight. The EEP threw its heat beam on. The beam shifted in a wide band towards the crowd of Pasudeti. Crude hand weapons appeared. A clatter of bullets burst around Tony. They were firing at the EEP. He was dimly aware of the metal body beside him. A shuddering crash. The EEP was toppled over. The crowd poured over it. The metal hull was lost from sight. Like a demented animal, the crowd tore at the struggling EEP. A few of them smashed in its head. Others tore off struts and shiny arm sections. The EEP ceased struggling. The crowd moved away, panting and clutching jagged remains. They saw Tony. As the first line of them reached for him, the protective envelope high above them shattered. A Terran scout ship thundered down, heat beams screaming. The crowd scattered in confusion, some firing, some throwing stones, others leaping for safety. Tony picked himself up and made his way unsteadily towards the spot where the scout was landing. I'm sorry, Joe Rossi said gently as he touched his son on the shoulder. I shouldn't have let you go down there today. I should have known. Tony sat hunched over in the big plastic easy chair. He rocked back and forth, face pale with shock. The scout ship that had rescued him had immediately headed back towards Carnet. There were other Earthmen to bring out besides this first load. The boy said nothing. His mind was blank. He still heard the roar of the crowd, felt its hate, a century of pent-up fury and resentment. The memory drove out everything else. It was all around him, even now, and the sight of the floundering EEP, the metallic ripping sound as its arms and legs were torn off and carried away. His mother dabbed at his cuts and scratches with antiseptic. Joe Rossi shakily lit a cigarette and said, If your EEP hadn't been along, they'd have killed you. Beetles, he shrugged. I never should have let you go down there. All this time. They might have done it any time, any day, knifed you, cut you open with their filthy goddamn claws. Below the settlement, the reddish-yellow sunlight glinted on gun barrels. Already, dull booms echoed against the crumbling hills. The defensive ring was going into action. Black shapes darted and scurried up the side of the slope. Black patches moved out from Carnet, towards the Terran settlement, across the dividing line the Confederation surveyors had set up a century ago. Carnet was a bubbling pot of activity. The whole city rumbled with feverish excitement. Tony raised his head. They turned our flank? Yeah. Joe Rossi stubbed out his cigarette. They sure did. That was at 1 o'clock. At 2, they drove a wedge right through the center of our line, split the fleet in half, broke it up, sent it running, picked us off one by one as we fell back. Christ, they're like maniacs. Now that they've got the scent, the taste of our blood. But it's getting better, Leah fluttered. Our main fleet units are beginning to appear. We'll get them, Joe muttered. It'll take a while, but by God, we'll wipe them out, every last one of them, if it takes 1,000 years. We'll follow every last ship down. We'll get them all. His voice rose in a frenzy. Beetles! Goddamn insects! When I think of them trying to hurt my kid with their filthy black claws. If you were younger, you'd be in the line, Leah said. It's not your fault you're too old. The heart strain's too great. You did your job. They can't let an older person take chances. It's not your fault. Joe clenched his fists. I feel so futile. If only there was something I could do. The fleet will take care of them, Leah said soothingly. You said so yourself. They'll hunt every one of them down, destroy them all. There's nothing to worry about. Joe sagged miserably. It's no use. Let's cut it out. Let's stop kidding ourselves. What do you mean? Face it, we're not going to win. Not this time. We went too far. Our time's come. There was silence. Tony sat up a little. When did you know? I've known a long time. I found out today. I didn't understand at first. This is stolen ground. I was born here, but it's stolen ground. Yeah, it's stolen. It doesn't belong to us. We're here because we're stronger, but now we're not stronger. We're being beaten. They know Terrans can be licked, like anybody else. Joe Rossi's face was gray and flabby. We took their planets away from them. Now they're taking them back. It'll be a while, of course. We'll retreat slowly. It'll be another 5 centuries going back. There's a lot of systems between here and Sol. Tony shook his head, still uncomprehending. Even Lyri and Beprith, all of them, waiting for their time to come, for us to lose and go away again, where we came from. Joe Rossi paced back and forth. Yeah, we'll be retreating from now on, giving ground instead of taking it. It'll be like this today, losing fights, draws, stalemates, and worse. He raised his feverish eyes towards the ceiling of the little metal housing unit, face wild with passion and misery. But by God, we'll give them a run for their money, all the way back, every inch. End of Tony and the Beetles, by Philip K. Dick. Recording by Ian Bradford, Ngotngotaha, Pugh.
Experiment from Two-Timer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by George Thomas. Two-Timer by Frederick Brown. Experiment. Experiment. The first time machine, gentlemen, Professor Johnson proudly informed his 2 colleagues. True, it is a small-scale experimental model. It will operate only on objects weighing less than 3 pounds, 5 ounces, and for distances into the past and future of 12 minutes or less. But it works. The small-scale model looked like a small scale, a postage scale, except for 2 dials in the part under the platform. Professor Johnson held up a small metal cube. Our experimental object, he said, is a brass cube weighing 1 pound, 2.3 ounces. First, I shall send it 5 minutes into the future. He leaned forward and set one of the dials on the time machine. Look at your watches, he said. They looked at their watches. Professor Johnson placed the cube gently on the machine's platform. It vanished. 5 minutes later, to the second, it reappeared. Professor Johnson picked it up. Now, 5 minutes into the past. He set the other dial. Holding the cube in his hand, he looked at his watch. It is 6 minutes before 3 o'clock. I shall now activate the mechanism by placing the cube on the platform at exactly 3 o'clock. Therefore, the cube should, at 5 minutes before 3, vanish from my hand and appear on the platform 5 minutes before I place it there. "How can you place it there, then?" asked one of his colleagues. "It will, as my hand approaches, vanish from the platform and appear in my hand to be placed there. 3 o'clock. Notice, please." The cube vanished from his hand. It appeared on the platform of the time machine. "See, 5 minutes before I shall place it there, it is there." His other colleague frowned at the cube. "But," he said, "what if, now that it has already appeared 5 minutes before you place it there, you should change your mind about doing so and not place it there at 3 o'clock? Wouldn't there be a paradox of some sort?" "An interesting idea," Professor Johnson said. "I had not thought of it, and it will be interesting to try." "Very well. I shall not—" There was no paradox at all. The cube remained. But the entire rest of the universe, professors and all, vanished. End of experiment. Sentry from Two-Timer. He was wet and muddy and hungry and cold, and he was 50,000 light years from home. A strange blue sun gave light, and the gravity, twice what he was used to, made every movement difficult. But in tens of thousands of years this part of war hadn't changed. The flyboys were fine with their sleek spaceships and their fancy weapons. When the chips are down, though, it was still the foot soldier, the infantry, that had to take the ground and hold it, foot by bloody foot. Like this damn planet of a star he'd never heard of until they'd landed him there, and now it was sacred ground, because the aliens were there too. The aliens, the only other intelligent race in the galaxy, cruel, hideous, and repulsive monsters. Contact had been made with them near the center of the galaxy, after the slow, difficult colonization of a dozen thousand planets, and it had been war at sight. They'd shot without even trying to negotiate or to make peace. Now, planet by bitter planet, it was being fought out. He was wet and muddy and hungry and cold, and the day was raw with a high wind that hurt his eyes. But the aliens were trying to infiltrate every sentry post, and every sentry post was vital. He stayed alert, gun ready, 50,000 light years from home, fighting on a strange world and wondering if he'd ever live to see home again. And then he saw one of them crawling toward him. He drew a bead and fired. The alien made that strange, horrible sound they all make, then lay still. He shuddered at the sound and sight of the alien lying there. One ought to be able to get used to them after a while, but he'd never been able to. Such repulsive creatures they were, with only 2 arms and 2 legs, ghastly white skins, and no scales. End of Sentry. End of Two-Timer. Recorded by George Thomas, Traveler's Rest, South Carolina.
The Ultimate Experiment by Thornton DeKay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Mashing. The Ultimate Experiment by Thornton DeKay. No living soul breathed upon the earth. Only robots carrying on the last great order. They were all gone now, the masters, all dead and their atoms scattered to the never-ceasing winds that swept the great chrysolite city towers in ever-increasing fury. That had been the last wish of each as he had passed away, dying from sheer old age. True, they had fought on as long as they could to save their kind from utter extinction, but the comet that had trailed its poisoning wake across space to leave behind it, upon Earth, a noxious, lethal gas vapor, had done its work too well. No living soul breathed upon the Earth. No one lived here now, but Chiron and his kind. And, so thought Chiron to himself, he might as well be a great unthinking robot, able to do only one thing instead of the mental giant he was. So obsessed had he become with the task he had set himself to do. Yet, in spite of a great loneliness and a strong fear of a final frustration, he worked on with the others of his people, hardly stopping for anything except the very necessities needed to keep his big body working in perfect coordination. Tirelessly he worked, for the masters had bred, if that is the word to use, fatigue and the need for restoration out of his race long decades ago. Sometimes, though, he would stop his work when the great red dying sun began to fade into the west, and his round eyes would grow wistful as he looked out over the great city that stretched in towering minarets and lofty spires of purest crystal blue for miles on every side. A fairy city of rarest hue and beauty, a city for the gods, and the gods were dead. Chiron felt, at such times, the great loneliness that the last masters must have known. They had been kind, the masters, and Chiron knew that his people, as they went about their eternal tasks of keeping the great city in perfect shape for the masters who no longer needed it, must miss them as he did. Never to hear their voices ringing, never to see them again gathered in groups to witness some game or to play amid the silvery fountains and flowery gardens of the wondrous city, made him infinitely saddened. It would always be like this, unless... But thinking, dreaming, reminiscing would not bring it all back, for there was only one answer to still the longing: work. The others worked and did not dream, but instead kept busy tending to the 1,001 tasks the masters had set them to do, had left them doing when the last master perished. He, too, must remember the trust they had placed in his hands and fulfill it as best he could. From the time the great red eye of the sun opened itself in the east, until it disappeared in the blue haze beyond the chrysolite city, Chiron labored with his fellows. Then, at the appointed hour, the musical signals would peal forth their sweet, sad chimes, whispering good night to ears that would hear them no more, and all operations would halt for the night, just as it had done when the masters were here to supervise it. Then, when morning came, he would start once more trying, testing, experimenting with his chemicals and plastics, forever following labyrinth of knowledge, seeking for the great triumph that would make the work of the others of some real use. His hands molded the materials carefully, lovingly, to a pattern that was set in his mind as a thing to cherish. Day by day his experiments in their liquid baths took form under his careful modeling. He mixed his chemicals with the same loving touch, the same careful concentration and painstaking thoroughness, studying often his notes and analysis charts. Everything must be just so, lest his experiment not turn out perfectly. He never became exasperated at a failure or a defect that proved to be the only reward for his faithful endeavors, but worked patiently on toward a goal that he knew would ultimately be his. Then, one day, as the great red sun glowed like an immense red eye overhead, Chiron stepped back to admire his handiwork. In that instant the entire wondrous city seemed to breathe a silent prayer as he stood transfixed by the sight before him. Then it went on as usual, hurrying noiselessly about its business. The surface cars, empty though they were, fled swiftly about, supported only by the rings of magnetic force that held them to their designated paths. The gravoships raised from the tower dromes to speed silently into the eye of the red sun that was dying. No one now, Chiron thought to himself as he studied his handiwork. Then he walked unhurriedly to the cabinet in the laboratory corner and took from it a pair of earphones resembling those of a long-forgotten radio set. Just as unhurriedly, though his mind was filled with turmoil and his being with excitement, he walked back and connected the earphones to the box upon his bench. The phones dangled into the liquid bath before him as he adjusted them to suit his requirements. Slowly, he checked over every step of his experiments before he went farther. Then, as he proved them for the last time, his hand went slowly to the small knife switch upon the box at his elbow. Next, he threw into connection the larger switch upon his laboratory wall, bringing into his laboratory the broadcast power of the chrysolite city. The laboratory generators hummed softly, drowning out the quiet hum of the city outside. As they built up, sending tiny, living electrical impulses over the wires like minute currents that come from the brain, Chiron sat breathless, his eyes intent. Closer to his work he bent, watching lovingly, fearful lest all might not be quite right. Then his eyes took on a brighter light as he began to see the reaction. He knew the messages that he had sent out were being received and coordinated into a unit that would stir and grow into intellect. Suddenly, the machine flashed its little warning red light and automatically snapped off. Chiron twisted quickly in his seat and threw home the final switch. This, he knew, was the ultimate test. On the results of the flood of energy impulses that he had set in motion rested the fulfillment of his success or failure. He watched with slight misgivings. This had never been accomplished before. How could it possibly be a success now? Even the masters had never quite succeeded at this final test. How could he, only a servant? Yet it must work, for he had no desire in life but to make it work. Then, suddenly, he was on his feet, eyes wide. From the two long, coffin-like liquid baths there arose two perfect specimens of the Homo sapiens. Man and woman they were, and they blinked their eyes in the light of the noonday sun, raised themselves dripping from the baths of their creation, and stepped to the floor before Chiron. "I am Adam too," he said, "created by you, Chiron, from a formula they left in their image. I was created to be a master, and she whom you also have created is to be my wife. We shall mate, and the race of man shall be reborn through us and others whom I shall help you create." The man halted at the last declaration he intoned and walked smilingly toward the woman who stepped into his open arms, returning his smile. Chiron smiled too within his pumping heart. The words the man had intoned had been placed in his still pregnable mind by the teleteach phones and record that the last master had prepared before death had halted his experiments. The actions of the man toward the woman, Chiron knew, was caused by the natural constituents that went to form his chemical body and govern his humanness. He, Chiron, had created a living man and woman. The masters lived again because of him. They would sing and play, and again people the magnificent chrysolite city because he loved them and had kept on until success had been his. But then, why not such a turnabout? Hadn't they, the masters, created him, a superb, thinking robot? End of The Ultimate Experiment by Thornton DeKay. Recording by Ryan Mashing.